Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting schillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Emmett McGroarty, JD, the co-author of Restoring the Republic, executive director of Belmont House at Belmont Abbey College, and today's topic, Blueprint for Restoring Federalism to the United States. Emmett McGroarty, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Rob, it's morning in America, and it's great to be on.
Well, it is morning in America, and there is optimism here. I'm glad that we can have this discussion because I think had our previous election turned out differently, it would be a different topic of discussion. Tell us a little bit, an overview of the report, please.
The report is, the idea behind the report is there's lots of substantive discussion or discussion on particular programs that need to be started or ended or changed. We focused on the procedures and practices of the administrative state and what needs to be done to pull the administrative state back into constitutional order, what needs to be done to restore to their proper place in the Constitution, that's as separate sovereign entities, what needs to be done to protect citizens from being intimidated by their government, and what needs to be done to restore the president's management authority and to restore the separation of powers. That's the focus of our report. It's divided into 4 parts, addressing each of those separate areas, including protecting state sovereignty. And we offer about 25 different recommendations for legislation and executive order. We stay away from judicial action and proposing constitutional amendments. Those issues are, I think, well handled by a number of different entities.
So one of the problems is that we have lost the concept of federalism, and I'd love to talk about what that means because most people don't know anymore or don't have a clear understanding of it.
Adam White, who's at Scalia Law and American Enterprise Institute, wrote the foreword to our book, and he makes the great observation that we really don't even have full discussions now of returning to federalism or protecting federalism. American federalism is its own idea, and that idea is that you have separate sovereigns. You have the federal government handling a limited number of matters, those things that are national in scope that have to do, for example, with war and peace and things like that. And the rest should be, what the framers intended to do was preserve the great systems that had developed naturally in the colonies, whereby the people handled most of the matters at the local level, and then for those things that couldn't be handled at the local level, sort of the colonial government or now the state government handles those things. That ensures liberty in 2 respects. Number one, the people have a very real sense day to day as to what's happening and what needs to be done. They have a true hand in shaping their environment. The second way, of course, is the division of power. You never want to have one entity, one branch of government or one government with all the power. That's what leads to tyranny on one hand and alienation of the people from their government. Up through the 60s, we had in the United States, we had a very, very high level of confidence and trust in the federal government. Even in the turmoil of the 60s, we had high levels. As government has been growing and growing, that trust in government, confidence in government has been steadily declining. It's really an inverse relationship, and to now it's down at very, very low levels, usually year to year in the teens, and that's frightening. That's frightening if we're to keep the republic.
And this is something I want to get into, and specifically the undermining of federalism in America. A couple of points here. The first one I want to talk about is the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, which was really a stake in the heart in many ways of federalism.
That 17th Amendment, that was, well, all of this stuff, all of this wrecking of government is sort of the progressive socialist assault on our Constitution. And it's a 125-year march against that. At the heart of it, it's because the progressives and socialists, they don't trust the people. We're bad and we're rubes, we're dumb. So the 17th Amendment, of course, said, well, the states will no longer select the senators. We're going to put that to popular election. On the initial take on it, one might say, oh, well, that's good. The people have a direct say now. But it's not good if you look at the overall structure of the Constitution, which includes, of course, the people. And you have so much being done through the states, and the people very much engaged in a day-to-day perspective in local government and their state government. So with all of that going on there, and the states protecting rights and safety, the idea is that the states need kind of representation in the federal apparatus. And so that's what that did. The state selection of senators kept that tether, kept that relationship whereby the federal government had to essentially turn and acknowledge and respect the states. And most of all, of course, respect the rights of the people. This direct election severed that relationship. So that's why that's bad.
And yet things like that, which are bad for the country on whole, are very difficult to reverse. I mean, could you imagine a case in which this could be reversed in today's United States of America? Because I certainly have a hard time with that.
Yeah, until maybe a year or two ago, it was difficult. Now I think there's promise because we've developed our own media that we can go around the elite opinion streams, right? There's elite opinion streams, Hollywood, academia, with the exception of wonderful colleges like the one I work for, Belmont Abbey College.
Yes.
The academia, Hollywood, the corporatist America that's trying to shape our views, big government. So and then the legacy news media. Now we've sort of figured out how to work around those elite opinion streams, and what's more, those elite opinion streams have been discredited. They've been discredited. I think that they've been surviving on support from the far left, and then sort of the middle of the spectrum, and by that I mean people who don't really pay attention what's going on, maybe because for family reasons or work or lack of interest, that group of people who don't pay attention, and then they just tune in right before an election. And those people have been going along with the flow of the tyranny of the majority proposed by the elite opinion streams. Elite opinion streams have been discredited, and now I think we can have a real conversation about what needs to be done. And we're starting to hear more about this, whether to repeal the 17th Amendment and issues like that. Rob, it reminds me of when I was little, when the Soviet Union was around, and there was the Iron Curtain, and people, especially the legacy media, they would say that they would work on the premise that we'll always have the Soviet Union, and we're always going to have to be in fear of them and intimidated, and we just need to pay our dues and hope they leave us alone. Lo and behold, the Soviet Union fell, and that was something that many people never thought would happen. And I think with things like the 17th Amendment, that's where we are.
You know, there's another plan that had been making the rounds, and then it's been strangely absent from the conversation after the last election. That was the push for a national popular vote. Again, an attack on federalism in a big way. Have you heard anything from the national popular vote people since President-elect Trump actually took the national popular vote?
No, I think that they've been strangely subdued. Once again, you know, that's just another kind of socialist progressive idea in the electoral college. Of course, what does it do? It divides power in a certain sense. It protects sort of the minority view, the minority political view. It ensures that we'll have a robust discussion on the issues. You know, if we had a popular vote, right, Rob, you might as well just shut down your show.
Yeah.
And all your people can just forget about national politics. Forget about it. You know, everything will be decided in New York City and Los Angeles and Chicago. That's all you need.
I hear a lot of talk, Emmett McGroarty, about our quote-unquote democracy. And again, I think this is a failure of the education system, that more people don't understand the difference between a democracy and a republic. And sometimes I think this is intentional, the use of that term, but other times I think it's out of ignorance of people who should know better. What do you make of that discussion?
It is intentional, and it's intentional. The progressives want people to be ignorant about their culture. And that includes, of course, the great American founding. And the reason why they want people to detach from history and their culture is because, as Woodrow Wilson said, you know, the purpose of government, its motive power, he called it, is to improve public opinion. The purpose is for government to tell people what they should believe. And this Constitution stuff, that gets in the way of that. And this divided power, that gets in the way. And the legislature, the Congress and the legislature in the states, that gets in the way, right? You can't have Congress making policy, because that takes away from the primacy of the experts. That's what that at the end of the day, the progressives wanted experts to tell us what to believe and what to do, and they didn't want anything that interfered with that, including this notion of our inherent natural rights. That's something that the expert doesn't like. Well, that's kind of a threat to my authority if these people have rights. Wilson even said that this is a big problem. It's a big problem with these Americans. They know what their rights are, and they intend to use them. That's a problem. He said that explicitly. So you saw from the late 1800s all the way up until relatively recently, you saw a big suppression of things like the discussion of Alexis de Tocqueville and democracy in America. And why that? Well, he recognized the beauty of what America had done, and really why it was a sort of a shining light for the whole world. Studying, as you know, he was studying what the difference between the greatness of the peace and prosperity of the American experiment versus the revolution in France, which was it was inspired by our revolution, but the one in France just descended into tyranny and violence. In ours, we flourished. And de Tocqueville said, well, why this difference? One of the big differences was that the French Revolution, what they did is, in the end of the day, they kept the powerful bureaucracy that the Sun King had formed and strengthened. Gets back to why we've got to rein in this administrative state.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with our guest, Emmett McGroarty, in just a moment.
Online at schillingshow.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
SchillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
SchillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit SchillingShowMedia.com. That's SchillingShowMedia.com.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
We return now with Emmett McGroarty and the blueprint for restoring federalism to the United States here on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. So let's go to the plan itself. And the first one I want to talk about is strengthening presidential authority. You know, there are those we've heard saying that the president has too much authority or that the executive branch has been overly emphasized. So what are you recommending?
Well, Rob, there's two things going on here. The Congress has invested a lot of authority in the executive branch, sort of. Much of this authority is invested in the administrative state, the bureaucracy, and then Congress, in time and time again, and they've shielded the president from managing that bureaucracy. So that's what's going on. So, you know, we're saying we've got to restore the president's ability to manage the bureaucracy. And that's a good thing. Why is that a good thing? Because the president is accountable to the people, number one. Number two, as Alexander Hamilton said, in terms of executive action, if you don't have one person who's accountable, then people are confused as to who really is responsible. And that's another thing that the progressives have done. They think it's great, but it's a terrible, terrible tragedy. You know, you have someone sitting, a mom sitting down in her at the kitchen table talking to her husband about, well, why is our local school, why are they doing this or that? Why is it that the children really, they're studying this new math? They're not really reading the great works of literature anymore. Why is that? Who's responsible for this? And it's kind of hard to figure out. Well, is it the federal government? Is it the state, the local? That is all sort of a symptom of this weakening of presidential power and the muddling of the lines between the federal government and the state and local governments.
There was an interesting piece of legislation proposed recently by Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who was attempting to tie the hands of the incoming president in regard to the administrative state and what Tim Kaine referred to as, you know, these dedicated public servants who are not biased, and we don't want the president firing them and replacing them with political hacks. I'd love to get your take on that legislation.
So the president's hand has really been tied, and you look at it in very practical terms. The president's hands have been tied in terms of simple things like firing and disciplining employees who don't do their jobs or who exceed their authorities. That needs to be changed. Any businessman, any father, any mother can say you need to have management authority. This is pretty basic, but again, this is something that the progressive ideology is, the expert is supreme. The progressives, their view is you just leave it to the experts, and through the science of administration, they can decide what needs to be done. We see that mentality. This is not just an abstract thing. We saw this mentality in Anthony Fauci.
Yes.
I am science. You just need to do what I tell you to do. Of course, you know, even if he's making it up, stand 6 feet apart.
The IRS is one of the agencies that seems particularly out of control, and of course, they just got a lot more resources. What are your specific proposals regarding IRS and regulating that agency?
The IRS, there's a couple categories of agencies. The IRS is one of them who has, in many respects, it's been accepted from the management apparatus that the president has, which includes the Office of Management and Budget and an office within the OMB the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. What these offices do is they track what's going on in the agencies, and they ensure that the agencies are following the law. They're staying within their statutorily and constitutionally authorized areas. Well, the IRS was, just by matter of sort of a quirk of history, they were accepted from this apparatus in many respects. That needs to be returned. And it needs to be returned for two reasons. Number one, I guess the idea was all they're doing is collecting money. They're not really pushing policy. That's just not true. It's especially not true anymore. Congress is increasingly using the IRS to kind of shape the minds of the people and to dictate policy. So the IRS needs to be brought in line for that reason. Secondly, and this is something sadly we even see on the right and among congressmen and congresswomen who are Republican or consider themselves conservative. There's this idea now with the information age, right? It's like, oh, wait a second. That IRS is collecting a lot of information on the citizens. So couldn't we really just take that information and use it? And you know what? Sadly, Marco Rubio came up with this idea. Senator Rubio, Republican from Florida. The idea is, well, colleges and universities, we need to ensure that students are getting a good return on their investment. So what we're going to do is we're going to track colleges and universities in terms of the return on investment, and then we'll make this information available to students who are taking out loans. Yes, of course, that's great if students have access to this information, but sort of, right? But if it's the government that's collecting this information, that's bad. And so what some of these congressmen and congresswomen want to do is tap into the IRS information databases and to pull this information out. This is terrible. We don't want to be collecting information on our citizens. We don't want to be doing that through the IRS.
Another thing I noticed recently, a big push for the direct file at IRS, which is essentially telling people to use the IRS as their own tax preparer. I found that particularly dangerous.
That is, and because of course we're giving the IRS even more information about how these decisions are made, and this is something, I think this gets back to what you were saying earlier, Rob. We've lost sight of what it is government is supposed to do and how it is we're supposed to control government and who it is government is supposed to be reporting to. And so this is part of this ignorance that's out there.
We've talked a lot about the states and state sovereignty, but what about individual liberty? What do we need to do there?
I guess it's no surprise now that people are intimidated by the government. We see that government in all sorts of ways for political reasons, they start going after the citizen. We need to have a concerted effort to rein in enforcement actions, regulatory agency enforcement actions. This is sort of like a deviation from the common law, I say, so the common law, which included originally the criminal law, but also private kind of tort and contract law, was all of it was premised on the idea of what a reasonable person would do, what the expectations of peace are of a citizen. The administrative state is premised on the idea that there's new areas of conduct that need to be regulated, and many of these are things that inherently don't seem inherently bad. So, for example, an elderly man concerned about the wildfires in the area, and so he builds a series of ponds and ditches around his property. Well, famous case went up to the Supreme Court where the administrative state went after him for violating various land use regulations. And of course, he was just doing what people normally and reasonably do. So we've got to look at this whole apparatus, and we've got to ensure that the rights of the people are protected and that the agencies don't exceed their authorities. For example, we have proposals on guidance documents. Guidance documents cannot be used as regulations. If an agency, like say the EPA, issues a bulletin commenting on something, that doesn't have the force of a regulation unless it's processed like a regulation with due notice and publication as if it were a regulation. There has to be a firm separation of adjudication and investigative functions within an agency. So the same office in an agency can't investigate an alleged transgression and adjudicate it. The agencies should not be able to use the press as a way of intimidating the subject of their investigation. Of course, we've seen this most notoriously in the lawfare cases, right, where the FBI decides it's going to raid somebody and then gives notice to the press and then makes a media spectacle out of it. And all of that, of course, is to sway public opinion, and not through the adjudication process, but sort of by tyranny of the majority. There has to be clear standards against bringing enforcement actions unless there is a clear legal foundation. And then every agency should have written procedures for evaluating the case for legal sufficiency before bringing the case. There should be a firm rule on disclosure of exculpatory information. That's something that is a matter of Supreme Court law. It's called your Brady rights. When a criminal case is brought against someone, the federal and state prosecutors have a constitutional obligation to give to the defense all the evidence they have on the case, including all the exculpatory information. That rule does not exist across the federal administrative state. I think some agencies have it, some don't. That needs to be in there. That's very, very important. There needs to be standards on adjudicating cases promptly. You can't have an administrative agency just bring a case or an enforcement action and then just let it sit there year after year after year, causing of course, great turmoil and angst among the subject of the investigation and bleeding that person dry financially.
This is such important information, and people need to read this report. Would you tell our listening audience how they can get a copy?
So you can get a copy through the Pioneer Institute out of Massachusetts. It's a great constitutionalist policy organization, and you can download it for free, or you can order from them a hard copy as well. They're at pioneerinstitute.org.
It's highly recommended reading, and I hope that these policies are implemented. Emmett McGroarty, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Rob, thank you very much. It's been an honor and pleasure.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.